Hello and welcome to today's webinar for the application for the Title VI Language Resource Centers program for fiscal year 2022. My name is Carolyn Collins. I'm the program officer for the Language Resource Centers, or LRC program, as we like to call it. And we're delighted to have you all with us today. I see we have about 50 people on the line, which is great. And hopefully more will watch this after the fact. We are recording the session today and we'll post the recording on IFLE's YouTube channel. Hopefully later today or early tomorrow, that will be available to stream anytime. So if there's anything you need to go back to review again, you're welcome to do that, or also, of course, to share that link with any colleagues that also may want to watch the webinar. So today's session is really designed to present you with the information you'll need to know for the application this year. The LRC program competes once every 4 years. And so we know it's a big opportunity for many of you to think about the projects you'd like to implement over the next 4 years and to put together a competitive application package. And so the information today is really designed to assist you with that, to know what to expect, and to help you succeed. If you have any questions during today's session, you're welcome to put them in the chat box. Microsoft Teams has a little sort of chat bubble icon at the top. So if you click that, you should be able to pull up the chat window and enter your questions via, via typing. Everybody's been placed on mute with cameras off, so interacting via the chat is the best way to ask your questions and hopefully get them answered. I'd ask you to try to hold off to ask questions until the end. We have a lot of slides to get through, about 65 slides before Q&A. So hopefully some of your questions will be answered along the way. And with that, I'm going to begin. I'm going to turn my camera off so that we can all focus on the slide deck. Okay, so during today's webinar, first we'll talk about what is the Language Resource Centers program, what is its purpose, and how does it fit within the mission of Title VI. Then we're going to talk about LRC activities, what kind of activities are allowable and what kind of activities we normally see conducted by our grantees. We will next talk about the specifics of the fiscal year 2022 competition, which I know many of you are dying to know about. Then we'll go into the nitty-gritty of the application parts. And finally, we will finish with some time for Q&A. I didn't get any questions ahead of time, so we'll just do those live via the chat. And as I said, you're welcome to submit those anytime, but if you can hold off until the Q&A session, that may keep things a little bit more streamlined. Okay, so first let's talk about the purpose of Title VI funding and the Language Resource Centers, or LRC program. Title VI funding was authorized under the Higher Education Act of 1965, which was reauthorized in 2008 as the Higher Education Opportunity Act. Title VI programs are really, or Title VI funding rather, is designed to support centers and programs at U.S. institutions of higher education to strengthen capacity in area studies, international studies, and foreign languages to meet national needs. This fits within the broader mission of the U.S. Department of Education to really prepare students to be competitive in today's global workforce. Title VI funding awards area studies and language training fellowships to undergraduate and graduate students. It also creates foreign language instructional materials, assessments, and surveys. And finally, it promotes access to research and training overseas. So this is what Title VI funding does very broadly. The LRC program does not do all of these things listed on this slide. It really does specific things to promote, strengthen, and encourage the development of foreign language instructional materials, assessment surveys, research, do teacher training, really the idea of developing, resources, language resources for the teaching and learning of foreign languages for US students. So the LRC program purpose specifically is that the program makes awards for the purpose of establishing, strengthening, and operating centers that serve as resources for improving the nation's capacity for teaching and learning foreign languages effectively. The term Language Resource Center really just means a coordinated concentration of educational research and training resources for that same goal of improving the nation's capacity to teach and learn foreign languages. A couple of things I would point out here are that the LRC program, it's one of our national resource programs. So it's always good to keep in mind that the materials you're developing, the research you're doing, and any other activities you're doing are really being funded through the LRC program with the intention that they're going to eventually serve as resources to our whole nation, whether that's being a resource online that anybody throughout the nation can access at any time, and open educational resources, digital sort of language learning, or whether that means that you're just teaching the students who are currently students who may in the future become experts in these particular regions, translators, doctorates, teaching at universities. The end goal is that all of this activity is serving the nation. The other thing I would point out is that within the mission of Title VI, the LRC program is really focused on foreign languages. So sometimes we've had questions regarding the inclusion of languages that are indigenous to the United States, Native American languages. And while, of course, we encourage all language learning, the mission of Title VI is really focused internationally, so outside of the borders of the United States. And so as the laws are currently written, the legislation currently stands, the mission of Title VI remains outwardly focused. So we do not generally, allow activities that would be more domestically focused in terms of domestic languages that are indigenous to the U.S. and not spoken in any other or used in any other nation, or I guess any other country around the world. So that's just a couple of items I would point out here. In terms of eligibility, you have to be an institution of higher education or a combination of institutions of higher education in order to apply for and receive an LRC grant. Individuals can't apply for these. Nonprofit organizations can't apply for these. It must be an institution of higher education or consortium of institutions of higher education. Applications that disregard the guidelines that are published in the Federal Register will be declared ineligible. The official notice inviting applications, or NIA as we like to call it, that'll be issued in the coming weeks. And that is going to be the official set of guidelines that you must follow for the competition. So any kind of conflicting information you hear out there, you should always defer to what is officially published in the NIA. So, so that will be part of my advice later, to really focus on that and always go back to that if and when you have questions. The next section of the presentation today will talk about LRC activities, what's allowable, what you must do, what you can do, and what is not allowable. So LRC activities, this is right from the regulations, must include effective dissemination efforts, wherever applicable in all authorized LRC activities. Of course, you all know this, I'm sure. We want these activities to be disseminated, to be serving as resources on all levels, locally, regionally, nationally. So whatever you're doing, we want you to publicize it, share it, and we want those resources to go out there. LRC activities may include the following things. These are, again, part of the regulations. These are options for your activities. You do not have to do all of these activities, but pretty much every grantee center does some combination of some of these following activities. So number one, the conduct and dissemination of research on new and improved methods for teaching foreign languages, including the use of advanced educational technology. Number two, we have the development and dissemination of new materials for teaching foreign languages to reflect the results of research on effective teaching strategies. Next, there is the development, application, and dissemination of performance testing appropriate for use in an educational setting to be used as standard and comparable measurement of skill levels in foreign languages. So that's assessment and evaluation. We have teacher training, of course, in the administration and interpretation of foreign language performance tests, the use of effective teaching strategies, and of course, the use of new technologies. We also have a significant focus on the teaching and learning needs of the less commonly taught languages, including an assessment of strategic needs of the United States, a determination of the ways to meet those needs nationally, and the publication and dissemination of instructional materials in less commonly taught languages. Or sometimes we say LICTLs. That's what we mean, less commonly taught languages. And we'll discuss that in a little bit with regards to one of the priorities for the next competition. Next, we have the development and dissemination of materials designed to serve as a resource for foreign language teachers at the elementary and secondary school levels. So that's, your K through 12 outreach component. And really that can be K through 16 because, a lot of these materials can also be used at the post-secondary level. And finally, the operation of intensive summer language institutes to train advanced foreign language students, to provide professional development, and to improve language instruction through pre-service and in-service language training for teachers. Many of our current group of language resource centers offer these intensive summer language institutes, and a lot of them are focused on teacher training. So that's a common activity that we see under this program. So in a quick summary, and this comes from the brochure from our current group of language resource centers. If you're curious to look at that brochure, it can be found on their joint website. I'm going to put that in the chat. It's www.nflrc.org. And that kind of shows you what a lot of our current grantees are doing and may give you some ideas of things that are possible under this program. But really, you can look at these, in 8 different categories. We have research, teaching materials, digital tools and resources, assessment, professional development, less commonly taught language initiatives, K through 12 initiatives, and of course, outreach and dissemination. Okay, so the next section is really going to dive into the fiscal year 2022 competition. And a quick note for the question that just came in about viewing the PowerPoint. If you, I believe that Teams has some tabs at the top, so if you can maybe click around and try to find a button that says, view content or shared content. That might be where you'll find it. If not, I am going to share a PDF of the slides. Let me actually do that right now for you guys in the chat, and that way you can follow along. You can follow along on your own. Let's see. Just give me 1 second. Okay, my apologies. I'm not sure I can easily share it in the chat. I was trying to upload a PDF version, but it doesn't seem to want to let me do that right now. But I will be posting these slides afterwards as well on our website. So if you go to the IFLE website, it's www.ed.gov/OPE/IEGPS. That will take you to our homepage if you click on the Language Resource Centers program. And then if you click on the tab that says Applicant Info, there will be a section there for tips and assistance with the webinar recording, and that is also where I will post a copy of the slide deck. So again, you can keep an eye out for that tomorrow. All right, so back to the presentation. Let's talk about the fiscal year 2022 competition. As I mentioned, this program competes only once every 4 years. And so this is the time when everybody gets to throw in their hats to try to secure LRC funding for the next 4 years. So the official announcement of the fiscal year 2022 competition will happen in the Federal Register. The Federal Register is the official source for all grant opportunity announcements and other news coming out of the federal government. So you can go to federalregister.gov and you can actually set an alert there. If you do a search for language resource centers, and then there's a way that you can set a reminder so that anytime there's a mention of the program in the Federal Register, you'll get an automated email. That's what I would suggest that you do, because that is where the official announcement will be posted first. We'll get it up on our website as soon as we can, hopefully that same day. But the Federal Register is really the end-all be-all place for official government announcements. We'll also send out a newsletter with more information about the program and, of course, links. But again, really pay attention to the Federal Register as that is where you'll see the notice. So the notice inviting applications, or NIA, will be published very soon in mid-February. The final clearance processes for the paperwork are underway right now. Some government, bureaucracy involved there, but we are working on it, and we are very hopeful that the announcement will be made sometime within the next couple of weeks. So keep your eyes out. Once the NIA drops, you will have 60 days to apply. So let's say the announcement goes out, at the end of next week. Then you would have, let's say, February 18th. I don't know if that's when it would go, but if in that case, you would have 60 days from that date. So the deadline would be in mid-April. So the program funding to expect this year, we expect level amount of funding as for the last few years. So that would be a total amount of $2 million, $2,746,768. The range for awards would be between $130,000 and $197,000 per LRC. The average award coming out to be around $171,000. Sometimes with these budgets, we get questions, about, hey, can I ask for more than that? Yeah, of course you can. We just give you these numbers to give you a sense of what's realistic. You can ask for more than that, but just know that the likelihood is that if you were selected for funding, we would only be able to offer you somewhere within that range of available funds. A lot depends on how many applications we receive, the quality of those applications, how they're scored and ranked, and how much money everybody asks for. So we do our best to offer, amounts that will allow centers to still conduct most, if not all, of their proposed projects. But it really is it's a ballet. It's a fine art in terms of figuring out how much money we have available, how much we can offer, what activities can be funded. There's a whole negotiation process on the back end. Once we offer the funding, then we work with each institution to come to a final budget that will be implemented over the grant cycle. So these are the amounts you can generally keep in mind, in terms of what we might be able to offer this year. As I mentioned, this program only competes every 4 years. That's because the LRC performance period is 48 months long. This covers 4 fiscal years, 2022 through 2025. The project start date, if you apply for and receive and are selected for funding, your start date would be August 15th, 2022, with an end date of August 14th, 2026. It's important to note that these funds, they are awarded annually, but that is contingent upon the availability of funding and grantee performance. So in the worst case scenario where, there were massive budgetary changes on the federal government level, the funding could change. It's more likely though that the funding would remain about the same. But again, we just have to wait every year for Congress to issue its final budget and appropriations decisions, and it's only at that point every year when we can guarantee that the funds are there. And as you all know, Congress, Congress can take a little while to make those decisions, and sometimes we don't always have the confirmed funding exactly when we would like it or as early as we would like it. So we're all just doing our best to get the money out the door when we can. But under normal order, you could expect 4 years of funding, provided that you are meeting a certain performance standard at the end of every year, making substantial progress on your projects. What's new for fiscal year 2022? We are very happy to share that you will no longer have to develop and submit performance measure forms. These were the PMFs in the last couple of grant cycles. So we've eliminated those. They're no longer going to be part of the application. And of course, since they're not going to be in the application, you will not be asked to report on them if you are selected for funding. So that's the biggest change this year. In terms of the competition format, you will submit your applications electronically on grants.gov. It's the same process that you went through last time if you applied for the 2018 through 2021 fiscal year grant cycle. And it'll all be laid out in an application instructions document that we will post on our website, and we'll also attach to the application in grants.gov. So after you develop and submit your applications, we will do an initial screening to make sure that you meet the eligibility requirements. Once you pass that bar, your application will be submitted to a panel of peer reviewers. Each panel consists of 3 specialists who have appropriate expertise in world languages, language teaching and learning, and/or federal grant programs for international and foreign language education. Each peer reviewer reads your application and provides scores and feedback on the strengths and weaknesses of your proposal, basing all of that feedback on the program's selection criteria. The selection criteria will be included in the notice inviting applications, but we will also go through that in a second. And then once the peer reviewers have done their work, we rank the applications by score to determine which applications will be recommended for funding. In terms of the competition priorities for this year, we have 1 absolute priority and 1 competitive preference priority. The absolute priority it means that only applications meeting the priority will be considered for funding. So this is one of those basic eligibility bars. You must do this in order for us to review and consider your application for funding. The absolute priority is applications that propose activities with a significant focus on less commonly taught languages. This means any modern foreign language except French, German, and Spanish. I imagine most of you, if not all of you, are already doing this. All of our current, LRCs and for the past, I think, several grant cycles have all done great work with less commonly taught languages. In the past, this used to be a competitive preference priority, but at this point, everybody seems to be doing this with great success. And so at this point, it's an absolute priority for the program. So again, you must work with less commonly taught languages in order for your application to be considered. Then we have one competitive preference priority. This competitive preference priority means that if you meet the priority, you can receive up to 5 additional points. The priority this grant cycle is partnership with minority serving institutions, or MSIs, or community colleges. Under the priority, an applicant must demonstrate that the project will be implemented by or in partnership with one or more of the following entities: community colleges, historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and minority serving institutions. Note on this slide, I put it in green and I put it in bold as well. This priority is worth up to 5 points. So the maximum, if you're doing this in your application and you're doing it well, you can receive 5 points. If you're meeting the priority a little bit, but not very well, or there isn't a very robust description of your collaborations with minority serving institutions or community colleges, then you might receive less than 5 points. So it is on a scale here. It's not 0 or 5, it's up to 5. So just keep that in mind as you develop your proposal to really make sure you're maximizing your points on the competitive preference priority. The way that you can determine whether an institution meets the qualifications or meets the criteria for being an MSI or community college is by going to our website. The link is here. Use this, it's a spreadsheet. It's called the 2021 Eligibility Matrix. And go over to column AK. And if it says yes in that column, the institution in question does meet the requirements to be considered an MSI or community college. So your institution might be an MSI or community college, in which case you would meet the priority. But again, you want to make sure you're describing that so reviewers understand that. Or if your institution is not an MSI or community college itself, you can meet this priority by I guess planning collaborations, partnerships, outreach activities with MSIs and community colleges in the United States. And please note, those don't necessarily have to be just MSIs and community colleges in your local area or your state, your region. You can work with MSIs and or community colleges in other areas of the country. And we see our national resource centers and our language resource centers doing this more and more, especially with the technologies we all have now to be online and make resources available. It really expands the I guess, the number of institutions you can reach and work with in a significant way. So, so just refer to the spreadsheet at this link to find out if the institution you have in mind meets the eligibility criteria to be considered an MSI or community college. Okay, now we're going to talk about the components of the LRC application. First, we're going to go over just the basic forms. These are parts of most government federal funding applications. So the standard forms are the SF 424. That's the application for federal assistance form. It's very straightforward. There's also a form that is a supplement to that that's specific to the U.S. Department of Education. That's the Ed Supplemental Info Form. Then we have the budget form. That's the Ed 524. It's called the Section A Budget Summary. That's a very basic overview of sort of the 10 or 11 big categories that that the government uses to classify all budgets for federal grant programs. These forms will be available, in the application package and instructions. The instructions will have some additional guidance for you if you have questions about, any specific elements of the forms. So, so keep an eye out for the instructions package if you need additional assistance. Then we have the assurances and certifications section of the LRC application. That's made up of the SF 424B for non-construction programs. That's also the grants.gov lobbying form, certification regarding lobbying. We have the disclosure of lobbying activities form. And then finally, we have the General Education Provisions Act, or GEPA, Section 427 form. Those are, again, all standard forms. They will all be available in grants.gov. And your offices of sponsored projects should be very familiar with filling those forms out. The more specific elements of the application, I guess specific to your particular project, are of course the abstract, narrative, budget, and appendices. So this is comprised of the project abstract, the application or project narrative. That's what we call your your story, your write-up, your 50-page write-up that responds to the selection criteria and priorities. There's also the detailed line item budget or budget narrative, as it's called. That's really your detailed line item budget. It's your detailed spreadsheet where you break down your activities, by project. Basically, it's just a more detailed version of the overview budget. And then finally, there are the appendices, which are made up of CVs, position descriptions, letters of support, and an acronyms list if you want to include that. Especially with the LRCs, I know many, if not all, of our current LRCs have their own acronym, and many, again, if not all, work together. So it might be useful for a reviewer to have a reference list of acronyms as they go through your application. So the abstract, the suggested format is 1 page, single-spaced. This is where you articulate how your project aligns with the Title VI and LRC program purpose. It should be a summary of your activities and the anticipated outcomes of your proposal. And it should describe some of your unique characteristics in terms of mission and resources, as well as your internal and external constituencies. The narrative, this is where you address the selection criteria. And we're going to dive into each selection criteria in just a moment. The suggested maximum length for your narrative is 50 pages. That is a suggestion. It's not a hard and fast rule. So if you submit 51, 52 pages, that's not a problem. But, we always want to remind you that reviewers have a lot of work to do. They have a lot of pages to read, and you want to be respectful of their time and their effort. And you also don't want to annoy them by submitting something way longer than it's supposed to be. So just keep that in mind, and be careful. Try to stay within the suggested limit to the best of your ability. The selection criteria themselves are drawn directly from the program regulations. We have 8 criteria main criteria, I should say, and then we have the competitive preference priority. So the main criteria total 100 points. With the competitive preference priority, you can obtain a maximum of 105 points. The first criterion is plan of operation. It is what it sounds like. It's where you show that you have a high quality in the design of your project, that you have an effective plan of management in place, and this is where you should provide a clear description of how your project objectives relate to the purpose of the LRC program. The plan of operations section or criterion is also the section that addresses your use of resources and personnel to achieve your objectives. And it's also where you need to explain how you will provide equal access and treatment for project participants who are members of groups that have been traditionally underrepresented. So that includes racial and ethnic minorities, women, and handicapped persons. You do need to address that in your narrative. You should not just rely on the GEPA form. That's the standard, government grant form where you sort of affirm that you won't be doing any discriminatory practices. That's not enough. Reviewers need to see you explain how you're going to provide equal access and treatment in your narrative and for potential participants in your projects. So just make sure you include that here as well so that you're not missing out on any points. And I should note, all of these criteria are up to the number of points. So in that last example, the maximum number is 15 points, but a reviewer might say, they're doing it pretty well, but there are a few things that could be improved here. So, so we're going to award 12 out of 15 points. All of these are on the sliding scale. So again, you really want to think about how you can maximize your points and address all of the different the sub points under each criterion, so that you're not missing out on any points. The second criterion is quality of key personnel. This is worth a maximum of 10 points. This covers your project director, of course, but you also want to describe who are the other key personnel and faculty who will be working on your LRC project. You want to be clear about how much time each person is going to be committing to the project. And again, you want to affirm or reaffirm, maybe at this point, that you will be including and employing people who are members of groups that have been traditionally underrepresented. The quality of key personnel section also takes into account past experience and training of the project director, key personnel, and faculty working on the project. And, if and where appropriate, you should also feel free to include information on your partners and collaborations. So if you're working very closely with an outside organization on a particular initiative, it's appropriate to mention why that particular organization is qualified to be your partner and who is going to be working at that organization to make sure you're successful in your plan. The third criterion is budget and cost effectiveness. This is where reviewers check to make sure that your budget is adequate to support your project activities. So, you don't want to ask for too much money, but you also don't want to ask for too little. The reviewers need to see that the amount you're asking for is actually going to be realistic for achieving the projects you're proposing. They need to also make sure that the costs are reasonable. We have a definition for reasonableness coming up later, so just keep that in the back of your mind. And with the budget section, the reviewers will also be looking for you to submit an itemized budget and narrative for each year. When I say itemized budget and narrative, I'm really just talking about the budget and narrative section. That can be just a detailed line item budget. It doesn't necessarily need to be a prose description of the activities or your budget. It can be a spreadsheet that's just broken down line by line providing, those detailed, initiative by initiative descriptions. Although, if you want, if it makes sense to include a prose description as well, that's fine. But really, the spreadsheet is the most common way that we see these line item budgets. Continuing with this criterion, equipment costs may not exceed 15% of the grant amount. We'll get into the definition of equipment in a little bit, but that's part of the program regulations, this 15% cap on equipment costs. Indirect costs must be capped at 8%. That comes down from the department. That's for all Department of Education grant programs to institutions of higher education. So indirect costs, that calculation cannot be higher than 8%. And in terms of matching funds, if you list matching funds on your budget, on your official Ed 524 budget form, your institution will be held responsible for meeting that commitment. So matching funds are not required for this program. It can be beneficial to describe in your project narrative and potentially to show in your budget narrative, your line item budget, what kind of institutional commitment is being provided. But that's not necessary. That's not the same thing as agreeing to provide matching funds on your official Ed 524 form. If you list official matching funds on the Ed 524 form, we're going to check to make sure that the institution has provided those funds. If you don't list matching funds on that 524 form, again, you are still more than welcome to describe institutional commitment, in your narrative, but just be careful, in deciding if and how much you want to commit your institution to doing matching funds on that official 524. The next criterion is evaluation plan. This is a big one. It's worth 20 points. We don't have any criterion that's worth more than 20 points. So this is a good place to really make sure you are maximizing your points. This is a section where you talk about the quality of your evaluation plan, where you describe the methods of evaluation. The reviewers will be looking to make sure those methods are appropriate and to the extent possible objective, and that they produce data that are quantifiable. When I say objective, usually reviewers are looking, they're looking for evaluators who have a certain level of independence from the center. So many centers many centers will use an outside evaluator. Sometimes an institution will have an evaluation unit on campus that evaluates, programs across the university. In that case, that can be fine, but you need to describe in your narrative why is that okay? Why is this unit that's on campus going to be objective? You need to convince your reviewers that there is enough independence there and objectivity so that you can be assured, and we can be assured as the department, that the evaluations being done here are as objective as possible. The evaluation plan needs to be outcome-based, and it needs to draw on the science of evaluation and use trained evaluators. So that's kind of the same thing as the first bullet point on this slide. Evaluation experts and content experts need to be used. The evaluation needs to focus on grant activities and on larger program outcomes. And it should also, be clear what are the definable set of activities to evaluate and the outcomes that are being evaluated. The end goal of the evaluation, it's really about helping you improve your projects and methods and helping you document success and avoid repeating less effective activities. We are also, always interested to read these evaluations as they come in. But these evaluations at the end of the day, they're really about making sure you are doing the best work possible and improving, in the ways that you can, in order to maintain the success of the center. Okay, the fifth criterion is adequacy of resources. This is only worth 5 points. So you just want to convince your reviewers that you have adequate facilities to conduct the operations of the center. The regulations say other than the library. So, you certainly can and maybe should mention if you have a great library on campus. That can be a resource to the center, but you also should talk about your other facilities. For example, your language laboratories, your museums, any other facilities that would, redound to the benefit of the Language Resource Center. And reviewers, again, they'll just be checking, are the equipment and supplies that you're proposing adequate to achieving your projects? This next criterion is an important one just to be aware of, because this is the criterion that would be used in case of a tie. If two applicants, had the same total score at the end of the review, we would go to this criterion to break the tie. So in the need and potential impact category, reviewers will be looking for whether proposed materials or activities are needed in the foreign languages on which the project focuses, the extent to which those materials can be used throughout the U.S., and checking to see if the center, is going to be making a significant contribution to strengthening, expanding, or improving programs for foreign language study in the U.S. The next criterion is likelihood of achieving results, worth a potential 10 points. Reviewers will be looking for the quality of the outline methods and procedures for preparing your materials. They're going to be looking to see if the plans for your activities are practicable. And is your center, is it reasonable to expect your center to produce the anticipated results? So how likely is it that you're going to be successful? You need to convince the reviewers. Okay, the next criterion, description of final form of results, is just checking for the degree of specificity and appropriateness of the description of the expected results of, from the project. So again, you might have a clear idea in your head of what the LRC's final product looks like, or final products, as is more likely the case, but you need to be clear about that in your application narrative. Make sure the reviewers understand at the end of the 4 years, if this center is funded, this is what we can expect the final form of results to be. Does it look like the creation of a new language resource center? Does it look like the creation of a new summer institute for teachers? Any and all of the above things can go into this description. Finally, there's, of course, the competitive preference priority, which will be scored up to 5 points. And again, here, reviewers will just be considering how strongly is this applicant meeting the priority for partnership with minority serving institutions or community colleges. The next component of the application that we'll discuss is the budget. As I mentioned before, the Ed 524 budget form includes a number of categories. These are the broad categories that apply to pretty much all government programs, or I guess at least all U.S. Department of Education programs. So all of your activities should fall into one of these categories: personnel, fringe, travel, equipment, supplies. Contractual and construction don't apply to these programs. If you had a subgrant, for instance, you would place that under the other category, not under the contractual category. Although that's a somewhat minor, sort of distinction. But the other category can encompass a lot of your actual, activities. Then we have the total for your direct costs. That's a sum of lines 1 through 8. Your indirect costs, that's calculated off of your direct costs, and that is capped at 8%. And then finally, total direct costs, or actually that should say total costs, I believe. Training stipends don't apply to this program either. It's not appropriate to use LRC funds to fund student kind of fellowships or scholarships, so you don't need to worry about the training stipends line. This is what the Ed 524 budget looks like. I grayed out the lines that don't apply to you guys, so you can just focus on lines 1 through 5, 8 through 10, and then line 12 for total. And this form also shows that you should provide your estimated costs for year 1 all the way through year 4. So we want to see the entire project cost. The budget narrative is the same thing as your detailed line item budget. Again, it doesn't have to be in prose description form. This can look like an Excel spreadsheet. But this is where you really break it down and show us what are the specific activities that you're funding, how are you funding them, and where your reviewers can really dive in to see if your costs are reasonable. So you should use the same categories that you see on the Ed 524, so personnel, fringe, travel, other. Don't use budget categories and codes that might be specific to your institution. Use the government categories that you see on the Ed 524 form. You should ensure that your requests are consistent with and support the activities presented in the program plan, which is described in your narrative. You should present all of the budget years 1, 2, 3, and 4, ideally on one page. Although I've seen it done in different ways, it basically just needs to be understandable, and a reviewer should have a clear idea of how much money is going to go to each of these budget lines in and during which years. So that way the peer reviewer and me as the program officer can see the requested funding across the entire project period. If you are part of a consortium, then each institution's budget should be clearly labeled so that we understand, what portion of the funds are going to institution number 1, what going to number 2, and how are those, funds working together to achieve the mission. Your budget may include support for key personnel and staff who are necessary to ensure that the project will be conducted efficiently and effectively. You should review your budget to make sure that your costs are reasonable and appropriate. Sometimes reviewers will get into your detailed line item budget and they may question a cost if they see that an amount seems excessive for a particular activity. They're going to say, well, why do they want, $15,000 for project X when I did this project, a similar project last year, and it only cost me half that amount. So in those cases, you just want to make sure that you're describing why the costs are appropriate and reasonable. There could be legitimate explanations. Some places are a lot more expensive, cost of living, or, the going rate for certain activities is more expensive. But just make sure you describe that and explain that in your narrative so that if your reviewers, come across a questionable expense, they can see why that expense is in fact reasonable and appropriate. Your budget needs to be sufficiently detailed to support all of the stuff you describe in your narrative. And then finally, a tip is that you should cross-reference your budget with the page in the narrative that supports the budget item. That way, again, if a reviewer is looking at your line item budget and they say, this seems like a high cost or this seems too low, right? This kind of jumps out at me. Oh, I see that I can refer back to project narrative page number 35, and I'll see a description of that activity. Again, you want to make this as easy as possible for your reviewers, not only, to maximize your points, not miss any points, but also to make sure that you're helping your reviewers rather than hindering them. Okay, so here are a few budget definitions in case you had questions. Direct costs are typically costs charged directly to a federal award, and can include compensation of employees who work on the award, fringe benefit costs, the costs of materials, and other items of expense incurred for the federal award. Reasonableness is defined as, so in this case, it says compensation for employees will be considered reasonable to the extent that it's consistent with that amount that's paid for similar work in other activities at the non-federal entity. So that would be your institution. If there isn't a comparable employee position at the non-federal entity, reasonableness is determined by what would be paid for similar work in the labor market. Basically, it's the going rate, the going rate at your institution, the going rate in the market. So that standard of reasonableness also applies to, supplies or equipment that you might purchase. It needs to be the going rate. You can't charge more for it. No $15 muffins or $300 toilet seats. It needs to be reasonable. Compensation, personal services. That includes remuneration paid currently or accrued for services of employees rendered during the period of performance under the federal award, including but not necessarily limited to wages and salaries. Equipment is defined as anything that costs, it's an item or device that costs more than $5,000. At this point in the world, usually most computers are not considered equipment anymore. They're considered supplies because most computers are less than $5,000. Equipment is really for those big ticket items. And again, the amount of your budget that can go towards equipment is capped at 15% for the LRC program. Travel costs include the expenses for transportation, lodging, subsistence, and related items incurred by employees who are traveling for LRC business. So that can be domestic or international travel. You're welcome to include that in your LRC budget. And just note that that the travel expenses would have to comply with per diem rates that are set out by either the Government Services Administration or General Services Administration, GSA, that's for domestic costs, domestic travel, or by the State Department for international travel, or by the DoD for Department of Defense for U.S. territories. Publication and printing costs are allowable. And that can include electronic and print media, including distribution, promotion, and general handling. And we had it while we're on the budget. I see a question that came in regarding what I mentioned about paying students. You can't use LRC funds to pay for like fellowships. You can use LRC funds to pay for students who are working on the LRC project in a more student assistant capacity. So you absolutely can employ a graduate student through the LRC to help, compile and document digital resources. That's appropriate. A lot of our LRCs and also some of our other national resource centers do use grant funds for that purpose, so that's no problem. In that case, generally with the budgets, personnel, you would file a graduate assistant who's being paid hourly under the other category of your budget. The personnel category of the budget is usually reserved for people who are on salary, who are full-time kind of year-round employees. it's not a make or break issue if you filed it in the wrong category on your budget, because the reviewers would still understand. But our official guidance is that something like a graduate student assistant or another student assistant who's working part-time on the grant on an hourly rate would go under other. Okay, the final application element is the appendices. You will be including curricula vitae for your key personnel, your project director, the important staff who are going to be working for the LRC or on LRC projects. You're going to include position descriptions. That really is for proposed personnel those positions may not exist yet, but you're planning to create them and hire them if you receive the LRC grant. Those should be no more than half a page long. Letters of support, and then your acronyms list. Again, the acronyms list is not required, but it can be useful, especially in the context of the LRC program, where a lot of the LRCs have their own acronyms and work together a lot. So an acronyms list would certainly be useful. Okay, some application tips. My first piece of advice is to get organized. Take a look at the past successful proposals. That can be a really instructive, task to look at what other centers have proposed in the past. And the ones that you're going to see on that website were successful at getting funded. So it's a good way of kind of calibrating your ideas and figuring out, is this something that can compete with these other proposals? Does my idea for a center kind of fit in with this community of LRCs? So read through the applications. That's my first piece of advice. My other piece of advice, as I mentioned before, is set an alert on the Federal Register website. So that you'll know the minute the official notice inviting applications goes out, you will get an email from the Federal Register notifying you that that the season is open. The next, I guess, section of advice is really read before writing. If you're new to this program, you definitely should read the whole application project or application instructions document, in addition to the notice inviting applications. The application instructions document will contain information about the actual regulations and the program statute. And those are things that are really useful to understand. I know they're kind of boring government speak, but having a good understanding of why was this program created in the first place? Why did Congress authorize it? Why does it continue to be authorized and funded? That can really help you as you think about your language resource center in terms of achieving the mission of the program. That application instructions document, it will be posted in the grants.gov package, but it will also go on our website under the LRC program page. There's an applicant info tab, and there is, and on that tab, there is a current application section. That instructions document will go over the selection criteria again, and will also contain some more guidance for your budget. So that's a big resource for you as you get underway. These are some general tips that I think we give everybody who's applying to any of our international and foreign language grant programs. Number one, and this is really basic, but it bears repeating, address all of the selection criteria and sub-criteria. So really read those and make sure your narrative is answering every question. Again, some of these criteria have multiple kind of sub-questions contained within the description. So you want to make sure you're not just talking about one, but you're hitting every single point. Because again, those can be areas where reviewers will say, oh, well, they mentioned this, but they didn't mention their, non-discriminatory practices when they talked about their key personnel. So make sure you're not leaving any points on the table. To the extent possible, we recommend that you follow the sequence of the criteria listed in the application guidelines, and that you label them appropriately to facilitate the ease of reading. Just again, put yourself in the shoes of a reviewer. What would you like to see if you were coming to this application, as a reviewer? You have your technical review form, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but that's going to be laid out in the same order as the selection criteria. And so it makes sense that it would be easy for a reviewer to go through your narrative and read in the same sequence. And again, if you can label it, if you can say, hey, this corresponds to selection criterion A, or this section is addressing B. It's just one more way of making it easier for your readers. Limit your narrative to the activities for which you're seeking funding. We know that a lot of centers do a lot of activities, and not all of them are supported by the federal grant. That's fine. And in terms of presenting your center and your strengths, it can be appropriate to mention some of that in your overall introduction to who you are as a center. But when you get down into the nitty-gritty, keep it tight, keep it focused on what is the grant money going to be used for, how are your project activities going to be responding to the goal of the program. So, just try not to include too much extraneous, unnecessary information. You only have 50 pages. Summarize each of your proposed activities and how it will increase program impact. Describe in detail how the program will be accomplished and who it serves. Cross-reference your budget with your narrative page numbers, again, to make life easier on your reviewers. Use tables and graphs effectively. This is a good tip for people who are worried that they can't fit everything into 50 pages. You might be able to take some of that information and show it visually using a table and/or a graph instead. Tables and graphs, if they are organized as an appendix, don't necessarily have to count towards your 50 pages. So that's a sort of a trick that you might be able to use if you're worried about the length of your narrative. Provide an acronyms list if appropriate. And finally, please submit your application safely before the deadline. Don't wait until the last minute. Grants.gov is usually pretty easy to work with, but sometimes there are windows of time when the website will be down for maintenance. They usually announce it pretty well on the website, but because of things like that you may not be able to predict, we highly recommend having everything on your end ready to go well in advance of the deadline. We know that you'll probably have to work with your Office of Sponsored Projects and maybe some other offices on your campus. And coordinating all of that takes a lot of time and effort. We understand that. So just be aware, get things in before the application deadline. If your application comes in even 1 minute after the deadline, we can't accept it, as much as maybe we wish we could. Just don't play around there and make sure you are safely submitting in advance. The technical review form is what your reviewers will use to evaluate and score your application and provide you feedback on strengths and weaknesses. The TRF follows the selection criteria. It will follow the order of the selection criteria that are published in the NIA and that were presented earlier in this presentation. So use it as an outline for your narrative. That way, again, it'll be easier for reviewers. They'll know where to find things if you do it in that order. And it just makes life easier for everybody. A full copy of the TRF will be included at the end of the application package instructions document. But there's really nothing there that you didn't see here on the presentation. The TRF, it's basically the selection criteria description just pasted onto a form. So refer to the NIA selection criteria, go back in this presentation and look at all of the various criteria. That is how reviewers will evaluate your application. And now we're nearing the end, so I am the program contact. If you have any questions after we're done today, please feel free to reach out to my email, or you can call me. Email is usually a little bit better because I can respond, when my schedule permits. But hopefully we went over a lot of the essentials today. But I am available anytime you want to reach out. And on that note, now's the time to submit your questions using the chat box in Teams. I see we have some questions that have come in already. So I will scroll up and try to answer them as we go. But yeah, please feel free to submit and we'll just go down the list. Okay, we have a question regarding a limitation on the number of letters of support. There isn't a formal limit to the number of letters of support that you can submit. That said, you don't want to overwhelm your reviewers. At a certain point, it's kind of diminishing returns with letters of support. So we generally suggest a maximum of 5. Pick carefully and strategically. But usually, after 5 letters, there really isn't anything else that can be said that another letter wouldn't have already mentioned. So, we recommend 5. If you submit 6, that's not a problem, but try to keep it to 5. Can you please remind us how to set the alert for the NIA? Yeah, I don't have the exact steps on the top of my mind, but if you go to the Federal Register website, it's federalregister.gov. I believe if you enter the name of the program there, just in the search bar, just enter Language Resource Center. I'll try to do it right now to see if I can guide you. Yeah, so enter Language Resource Center. In the top navigation bar, you'll see on the right side, there are a couple of buttons. One looks like a little envelope. I believe if you click that, you can set a subscription. So basically set it, set a notice to subscribe to emails anytime Language Resource Center is mentioned. And that's how you do it. Okay. Yeah, so project director salaries, that's a good question. The LRC program doesn't have a formal ban on requesting project director salary support. That said, our recommendation is strongly to not pay the project director's salary off of the grant if you can help it. And that's really just a question of the institution showing commitment to the work of the center, and also, quite frankly, freeing up grant money for actual project activities. The LRC program does not offer a huge amount of funding, and so we like to see the grant money going towards projects and deliverables rather than salary. Especially when a lot of project directors are already on the institution's payroll in other capacities. But that said, I see Kenneth's question here is if it would be okay for a director salary to be offset by the grant for a specific period of time, for instance, during the summer, while not technically on contract. I think that would be acceptable. Especially when it's related to a particular deliverable, course development, creating a summer institute, things like that. that aren't part of the normal duties of the center director work, but are rather tied to a specific project. I think that would be it would certainly be allowable. But it's up to you to describe in your project narrative why, first of all, why that's necessary, why it makes sense, and maybe to answer any concerns that a reviewer might have. So just proactively think, if I was a reviewer and I saw this in my budget, would I have a question? And address that question, answer that question in your narrative. Just to proactively nip any concerns in the bud. But I think that would be an acceptable use of grant funds. Okay, for project evaluation, does the evaluation need to be done annually, or can it be done at the end of the project? That's a good question. Project evaluations do not need to happen every year. A lot of the time we see evaluations done kind of 2 times during the grant cycle. Every other year seems to be a good model. Waiting until the end of the project may raise some questions, because at that point there's really nothing you can do to improve. If you wait until year 4, well, you don't have any more opportunity to implement suggestions if the evaluation is done toward the end of year 4. So for that reason, if you were thinking about doing it just once during the grant cycle, I think it would make sense to do it a little earlier, maybe year 2, once the project is underway and you have some work to show for yourself, but there's also still time to make adjustments based on what the evaluators say in terms of feedback. But yeah, it doesn't have to happen annually. I would say once per grant cycle is acceptable, but again, you want to make sure that's a very robust evaluation, or twice during the grant cycle. Potentially one time can have a focus on some of the project, and the second evaluation can have a focus on the other half of the project. It can be structured a lot of different ways, but it just basically needs to make sense, and it needs to offer you the opportunity to implement the suggestions. Since we are not requiring the project performance measure forms anymore, have we replaced that with another instrument? For now, we have not replaced that formally with another instrument. In the future, we may ask for project evaluations to be sort of these independent evaluations that have been mentioned, to be uploaded into our project monitoring system, which is called IRIS. We may ask for those evaluations to be uploaded. And in any case, we always like those evaluations to be shared with the program officer. But at this point, we don't have a formal replacement for the PMFs. So you can just enjoy the fact that you don't have to do that for the application this year. But instead, just really focus on your evaluation section of your narrative and your plan. If you like the PMF kind of format and the way it made you think about your project, you're welcome to keep that kind of instrument in your application. We are not forbidding you from uploading an evaluation plan that might look a lot like a PMF as one of your appendices. You're welcome to do that. We're just not requiring it anymore. So you just have a lot more flexibility at this point with your evaluation. For letters of support, yeah, having more partners, I absolutely understand the question of, if you have more partners than 5, what would you recommend in terms of asking for letters of support? Again, that's really up to you. It's up to you to decide, who are the partners who you think best demonstrate the collaborations that your center has, and also the impact of your center. Who would be able to best, convey that information in a letter of support, finding diversity in your letters of support in terms of, well, here's another institution, but here's, here's an expert in this field, or, you know, diversity in terms of types of partners that are being represented. It's up to you, but just think strategically about what will be covered, and if a letter is already going to be addressing one aspect of your work, there's no need to have two letters to that effect. So just use your best judgment. Can tuition benefits be included for graduate assistants? Generally speaking, no. That question is more, it's more in the nitty-gritty of how a graduate assistant is being paid. You can employ a graduate assistant to work at the center. The actual payment of that graduate assistant is something that you kind of need to figure out and negotiate with your offices, your offices at the university. A lot of graduate assistants are paid sort of on an hourly rate, or, you know, in more of a stipend fashion, I suppose. You know, kind of a, yeah, like I said, an hourly rate. Generally, we don't like to see these center, you know, funding for these resource centers be used to pay tuition directly. A student is obviously welcome to use their payment however they like and to pay for their tuition, you know, as the next step, but we would not recommend putting tuition offsets on the LRC grant. Will the outside evaluator be considered a contract? Yeah, I mean, I suppose it would. Again, that depends on how your university prefers to handle those payments. But it would not go under the contractual line of your budget. That's for like other kinds of grant programs. For evaluation purposes, you can put the evaluator line in the other category of your LRC budget. And then you should work out with your Office of Sponsored Projects or how things are done at your university, how exactly to pay the evaluator. Can projects include contracting with small businesses or nonprofits that do language work in addition to independent consultants? They can, but again, you know, you should be careful and check with your Office of Sponsored Projects to see how that money can be dispensed. Sometimes we see sub-grants that are awarded. So basically, we would give you the grant, and then you would issue a sub-grant to another organization or institution. I would need to check some of the sub-grant rules to see exactly what that can look like. I'm not sure those can go to a small business or, you know, or independent consultant. So perhaps you can follow up with me by email, and I can give you a little bit more detail on that. So confirming the total amount each LRC can apply for. Yeah, so the range of awards, let me go back to that slide. The range of awards that we normally see is between $130,000 and $190,000. The average award, yeah, or $197,000. The average award is about $171,000. Again, you can request more than that if you want. You just want to understand that in all likelihood, this will still be the range of funding that we're able to offer. So so just know if you were to request $220,000, we may only be able to offer you 197, in which case we would have to go back to you and work out, you know, what projects might need to be reduced in amount of funding or perhaps cut while still maintaining the projects that are working toward the mission of the grant, and of course the projects that still meet the competitive preference priority. Can I comment on an advisory board? Is having one recommended? An advisory board is not required for the LRC program. That is something that I think you need to consider if that makes sense for your center. Advisory boards, I think, can certainly be of use in certain circumstances, but it's not required, so I don't really feel, I guess, confident in terms of weighing in either way. I think if you do have an advisory board, you'll want to describe in your narrative exactly who's on it, why are they on it, what are their qualifications, what capacity would the advisory board actually be working in with relation to the center. And if you don't have one, again, in the narrative, you want to describe, the key personnel who are working on the project, what is the plan of operation in place, how is that being guided, what is the impact being made by the center. Okay. How much overlap can there be between an NRC and an LRC application from the same institution? Could both centers say they are teaching the same LICTL? Yeah, there are current LRCs that are housed at institutions that also have one or more NRCs. So you might want to refer to our current, I'm going to actually put our current Google map that shows all of our current grantees. And if you click around on the current, so I'm putting the Google map link in the chat. If you click around, there you'll see, for instance, University of Texas Austin has an LRC currently. They also have a number of NRCs. And there are other institutions as well that have both grants. Both grants can support the teaching of less commonly taught languages. But the LRC grant and the NRC grant are really quite different. The NRC grant has a lot of emphasis on area studies and, the countries in which these languages are used. The LRC money tends to support really the development of resources for teaching and learning the languages specifically. So there is overlap sometimes, and there is collaboration, but the centers generally are doing pretty different things. Yeah, do subgrants have to be included in the original grant application? Yes, they should be. I suppose there are cases where we could do a budget revision to allow a subgrant later on in the process, but it would need to fit within the original scope of the grant. So, for instance, if you partnered with a minority serving institution on a particular initiative, and in the beginning, you had planned to pay the collaborators and associated costs directly, but later on in the grant, you figured out that it was actually going to make more sense to do a subgrant to that MSI and then have them issue the money directly. I think that's the kind of mid-grant cycle adjustment that could be made because the collaboration itself was described in the original grant application. But that gets into questions about revisions. Revisions are possible, but again, grant activities need to stay within the scope of the original application. So now is the time to really propose big changes and adjustments to your projects if you're already implementing an LRC, and if not, to think about how you're going to be able to do it over the next 4 years, because you don't want to have to make a lot of changes, especially if there's a significant amount of money involved. If you're making a minor adjustment of $1,000 here or there, that's not a big problem. But our bar is really once you start moving money around that is over 10% of the grant, and that's cumulative. but if more than 10% of the grant funds are being shifted, then we need to do prior approval. The program officer, that's myself, needs to approve it. So just think strategically right now about how you're going to be able to implement your grant, and try to the best of your ability to foresee what you'll need to do. Oh, okay. Yeah, I see a clarification that maybe the question about funding was per fiscal year or total. That's per fiscal year. So, so this would be the range of awards per year. So our current, so the total funding, that's $2.7 million an estimated $2.7 million for every single fiscal year of the grant. So just multiply all of these by 4 to get the total amount of grant funding. Okay, it's past 4:30 here, so I know we all have things to do. Are there any other questions? Now's the time to ask. And as I mentioned, if you think of any questions later on, please don't hesitate to email me. Okay, yeah, since the grant funding doesn't allow contractuals, can you still hire language instructors? Yes, yes, absolutely. Language instructors, that goes under personnel. So if they're being hired as salaried, full-time or for most of the year language instructors, you just put that in the personnel category of your budget. That's no problem. If for some reason there was a specific project that you needed 20 hours worth of a specific language instructor, then you can put that in the other category. But you absolutely can use LRC money to hire language instructors, especially for the less commonly taught languages, and that would be absolutely acceptable. Are brand new centers likely to unseat incumbents? That's an impossible question for me to answer without seeing the applications that come in. I can tell you that we do have some changeover in our group of LRCs. Every grant cycle, we have, a couple of new ones and a couple of ones that go out of the actively funded LRCs. I believe for 2018, we funded 16 centers, and 3 of those centers were brand new applicants, and they were brand new centers. So you definitely have a chance if you are thinking of proposing a new center. But just know that you will be competing with some centers that have been doing this a long time and that have a lot of resources. So take a look at their proposals and really, learn from the best. Yeah, can instructors be non-US citizens, non-permanent residents? That's a question for your university, since they would be hired as university personnel. We don't determine that or prescribe anything from our end. They just need to be hired, in accordance with the laws that are in place in your state and at your university. So I would check with your institution to find out about what's required, in order to be employed at your university. Okay, any other final questions? I can hang on the line for another 5 minutes or so if people do have other questions. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I will stay on the line for a few more minutes to do questions in the chat. But to everybody else, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your interest in applying. I hope to see applications from many of you. And again, don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any other questions. Thank you. Bye.